You're listening to Women's Media Center Live with Robin Morgan.
Welcome to Women's Media Center Live. I'm Robin Morgan. And this is our season finale, because we will be on hiatus until September, but back at the old stand then. Today we have a really bang-up finale for you, all about the Roaring Twenties, which we're about to enter. What they really were back then, how remarkably similar this period now is to what they were, and, perhaps most important, how do we avoid the pitfalls that they fell heir to? We also have a rather hilarious song for the Surrealism Corner, and of course there's fighting words at the end of the program. So let's get started by going inside those headlines. We're entering them again now, the Roaring Twenties. Last time around, they meant jazz. They were also known as the Années Folles in France, and as the Golden Twenties in Germany. It was a time to dance. The Charleston, the cakewalk, the black bottom, the flea hop. It was the first real globalization of American music, and it was black music. Duke Ellington, Ma Rainey, Louis Armstrong, Bessie Smith, Eubie Blake, Adelaide Hall, Fats Waller, Ethel Waters. A whole new way of playing the piano called the Harlem Stride style was created. The Republican Party candidate, Senator Warren G. Harding of Ohio's Front Porch Campaign, used national advertising in a major way with his slogan, America First, leading his nationalistic campaign. 1920 was the first presidential campaign to be heavily covered by the press and to receive widespread newsreel coverage, and also the first to use the power of Hollywood and Broadway stars who traveled to Marion, Ohio, for photo ops with Harding. Al Jolson, Lillian Russell, Douglas Fairbanks, and Mary Pickford were among the celebrities to make the pilgrimage. Harding was very popular at first. He served from 1921 to 1923 and died of a heart attack. After his death, however, a number of scandals, including the Great Teapot Dome scandal, the worst since Watergate came along, came to light, as did his extramarital affair with Nan Britton. These severely eroded his popular regard. He was succeeded by Calvin Coolidge, otherwise called Cautious Cal, Silent Cal, and the Sphinx of the Potomac. The Scopes trial, also termed the Scopes monkey trial, took place in Dayton, Tennessee. Highly publicized court proceeding of a Dayton, Tennessee high school teacher, John T. Scopes, charged with violating the Butler state law by teaching Darwin's theory of evolution. The trial's proceedings helped bring the scientific evidence for evolution into the public sphere, but also stoked a national debate over the veracity of evolution that, astonishingly enough, continues until today. Opening statements included Clarence Darrow's impassioned speech about the constitutionality of the Butler Law. But Judge John Ralston ruled out any test of the law's constitutionality or argument on the validity of evolutionary theory on the basis that Scopes, rather than the law, was on trial. Ralston also determined that expert testimony from scientists would be inadmissible. Well, of course Darrow lost. In the trial's aftermath, Tennessee prevented the teaching of evolution in the classroom until the Butler's Act's repeal in 1967. Women had finally got enfranchised in 1920 with the 19th Amendment. Well, at least white women had. Along with that vote came the strength of the progressive influence in the decade. Peace movements, good government, maternal care, and support for education and public health were among them. This, in turn, sparked reform movements that influenced Europe. Millions of women worked in blue-collar jobs and in white-collar jobs like secretaries. The increased availability of contraceptive devices like the diaphragm opened up new possibilities for women, and new machines like the washing machine and vacuum cleaner were promulgated as totally eliminating the drudgery of household work. Lesbian and gay life was pretty openly visible, but much more about that in the surrealism corner. The co-ed had come into existence as more women went to college. But so, unfortunately, had the feminine mystique, and so had Freud, Jung, Adler, and the concept of psychoanalysis. In 1923, the ERA was put forward for the very first time. The 18th Amendment to the Constitution, ratified in 1919, banned the manufacture and sale, but not the drinking, of, quote, intoxicating liquors, and at 12 a.m. on January 16, 1920, the Federal Volstead Act closed every tavern, barn, and saloon in the United States. This, of course, only drove the trade underground. In fact, Prohibition, in effect, gave birth to both the mafia and to the women's temperance movement, since women made the connections between liquor and domestic violence. Well, eventually, because it was deemed a loss of a lot of tax revenue to the government, eventually the 21st Amendment, which repealed the 18th Amendment, was proposed in 1933, and Prohibition officially ended with the ratification of that amendment on December 5th, 1933. But Prohibition was not the only source of social tension during the 1920s. An anti-communist Red Scare in 1919 and 1920 already was surfacing and encouraged widespread nativist and anti-immigrant hysteria, which led to the passage of a draconianly restrictive immigration law, the National Origins Act of 1924, which set immigration quotas that excluded Eastern Europeans and Asians in favor of Northern Europeans and people from Great Britain, for example. Meanwhile, the United States became the richest country in the world per capita. Since the late 19th century, it had already been the largest in total GDP. Its industry was based on mass production, and its society acculturated into consumerism. Radio became the first mass broadcasting medium. The very first commercial radio station in the country, Pittsburgh KDKA, started broadcasting in 1920, and 3 years later there were more than 500 stations in the nation. By the end of the decade, there were radios in more than 12 million households. At the same time, mass-produced vehicles became commonplace in the U.S. and Canada, the most important consumer product of the 20s. The Ford Model T cost just $260 in 1924, so by 1929 there was one car on the road for every 5 Americans, and an entire economy was born from automobiles. The need for gas, service stations, motels, auto repairs, and much more. It led to a new mindset celebrating mobility. Cars and trucks needed roads, bridges, and steady highway maintenance, largely funded by local and state government through taxes on gasoline. But now new infrastructure was required, plus industries like manufacture of tires and glass and refined fuel. Car dealers were franchised by car makers, and tourism soared with hotels and restaurants proliferating. The minimum wage was passed. Lindbergh flew solo across the Atlantic, while in Britain Amy Johnson was the first woman to fly solo from Britain to Australia. Babe Ruth and Jack Dempsey triumphed in sports. Art Deco and Expressionism and Surrealism began to flourish, and Hollywood came into its own, with Warner releasing The Jazz Singer in 1927, the first sound feature to include limited talking sequences, as well, horrifyingly, as blackface. Charlie Chaplin made his first 2 forays into greatness with The Kid and The Gold Rush. Urbanization reached a milestone in the 1920 census, the results of which show that slightly more Americans lived in urban areas, towns, and cities populated by 2,500 or more people than in small towns or rural areas. It was a time of great hope, and the progressive movement thrived. Hence the Great Migration, the boom in African American citizens migrating from the South, where Jim Crow was entrenching itself, north and west. By 1920, some 300,000 Black Americans from the South had moved north, and Harlem was a popular destination in New York. This migration and the ensuing increasing visibility of Black culture, which through jazz and blues was to spread worldwide, made many white Americans very uneasy. And millions of people, not just in the South but across the country, joined the Ku Klux Klan in the 1920s. The Tulsa Race Massacre took place on May 31st and June 1st, 1921, when mobs of white residents, some of them deputized and given weapons by city officials, attacked Black residents and destroyed homes and businesses of the Greenwood district in Tulsa, Oklahoma, otherwise known as Black Wall Street because of its phenomenal financial success. The NAACP pushed for the passage of the Dyer Anti-Lynching Bill, a law to make lynching a federal crime, but it was defeated by a Senate filibuster, the first of many, in 1922. Feminist Pauli Murray, in a series of letters to Eleanor Roosevelt, lobbied hard for an anti-lynching law, and Eleanor finally got it and came on board and tried to persuade FDR, but he was a no-go. There is still no federal anti-lynching law in this country. In fact, just last year, in 2020, one Republican, Senator Rand Paul of Kentucky, succeeded in preventing it from becoming law. The Senate formally apologized for not having passed it in 2005, but the law remains unpassed. Black Americans continued to seek stable employment, better living conditions, and political participation. But by the middle of the decade, the KKK had 2 million members, many who believed the Klan represented a return to the values that the city-slicker, roaring Twenties were trampling. More specifically, the Twenties represented economic and political uplift for African Americans and other poor Americans that threatened the social hierarchy of Jim Crow oppression. Many Black Americans who migrated to the North found jobs in the automobile, steel, shipbuilding, and meatpacking industries, but with more work came more exploitation. The 1920s marked a period of sharp decline for the labor movement. Union membership and activities fell sharply in the face of economic prosperity, a lack of leadership within the movement, and anti-union sentiments from both employers and the government. Nevertheless, in the face of this, in 1925, civil rights activist A. Philip Randolph founded the first predominantly Black labor union, the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. American literature had a great blossoming, fueled by the Harlem Renaissance, a major intellectual and cultural explosion that manifested itself in literature, music, stage performance, art, and even fashion. In literature alone, Zora Neale Hurston, Langston Hughes, Countee Cullen, Claude McKay, and the poet Anne Spencer were some of the giants. Paul Robeson and Josephine Baker dominated the stage. Bojangles, Bill Robinson, was the tap-dancing maestro, and Aaron Douglas and Augusta Savage ruled the visual arts. Marcus Garvey, Black nationalist and leader of the Pan-Africanism movement, came to prominence and clashed with W.E.B. Du Bois. Among the white writers, Dashiell Hammett and H.P. Lovecraft rose to prominence, along with Eric Maria Remarque's great book, All Quiet on the Western Front, and with Hemingway's constipated short sentences. Edna St. Vincent Millay, Sinclair Lewis, Sherwood Anderson, Tilly Olson, Edith Wharton, H.L. Mencken, Pearl Buck, and many others were widely read. F. Scott Fitzgerald partly defined the 1920s with The Great Gatsby, his novel, although it would be some decades before biographer Nancy Milford would finally reveal that his wife, Zelda Fitzgerald, conveniently stashed away in a sanatorium, had written a great deal of his work. The Dow Jones Industrial Stock Index had continued its upward move for weeks, and coupled with highly speculative activities, it gave the illusion that the bull market of 1928 to 1929 would last forever. But on October 29, 1929, known as Black Tuesday, stock prices on Wall Street collapsed. The events in the U.S. added to a worldwide depression, later called the Great Depression, that put millions of people out of work around the globe throughout the 1930s. In a sense, the 20s, it could be argued, were an age of identity. In a sense, identity politics for the first time. Women's identity, Black American identity. The Harlem Renaissance was not alone in echoing American progressivism, in its faith in democratic reform, in its belief in art and literature as agents of change, and in its touchingly uncritical belief in itself and in its future. That Renaissance began to end with the stock market crash of '29 and with the Great Depression, although its legacy never died and is still felt today. We have to take our first short break here, but coming right up is a surprising and quite funny and delightful Surrealism Corner. Subscribe to this program on your favorite podcast platform and leave us a review. Follow us on Twitter at WMC Live, like our Facebook page at facebook.com/WMC Live, and visit us at WMCLive.com for more information about our show and our guests.
You're listening to Women's Media Center Live with Robin Morgan.
Wherever wit and humor are employed, you know you're in the Surrealism Corner. In the 20s, same-sex loving became much more visible and more acceptable. London, New York, Paris, Rome, and Berlin were major centers of lesbian and gay life. During the 20s, gender bending was also quite common. Yeah, we did not invent that in the 20th century, or the 21st. The actor William Haynes, who was often named in magazines as the #1 male box office draw, openly lived in a gay relationship with his partner, Jimmy Shields. Alla Nazimova and Ramon Navarro were two other highly popular lesbian and gay movie stars, respectively, as was the inimitable Mae West, who even wrote a play about homosexuality titled The Drag, which was a huge box office success. Ma Rainey, the great blues singer, was known to dress in traditionally male clothing, and her blues lyrics often reflected her sexual proclivities for women. Ma Rainey was also the first person to introduce blues music into vaudeville, and her protégée, Bessie Smith, was another artist who used the blues as a way to express herself, with lines like these: "When you see two women walking hand in hand, just look 'em over and try to understand. They'll go to those parties, have the lights down low, only those parties where women can go." Another prominent blues singer was Gladys Bentley, who was also known to cross-dress. Bentley was the club owner of Clam House on 133rd Street in Harlem, which was a hub for lesbian and gay patrons. In 1926, a hit song across the country was Masculine Women, Feminine Men, And the lyrics went like this. Which is the rooster, which is the hen? It's hard to tell 'em apart today. And say, sister is busy learning to shave. Brother just loves his permanent wave. It's hard to tell 'em apart today. Hey, hey. Girls were girls and boys were boys when I was a tot. Now we don't know who is who or even what's what. Knickers and trousers, baggy and wide. Nobody knows who's walking inside those masculine women and feminine men. All this was to be crushed by the rise in conservatism in the 1930s, which drove everybody deep into the closet. And that was all too hideously unreal. It is time for our final break, and then I'll return with those fighting words. The Women's Media Center, founded in 2005 by Jane Fonda, Gloria Steinem, and myself, is a progressive, nonpartisan, nonprofit organization working to make women visible and powerful in media. You can learn more about the WMC at womensmediacenter.com.
You're listening to Women's Media Center Live with Robin Morgan.
As Santayana said, those who do not remember the past are condemned to repeat it. Fighting words indeed. It certainly has been consciousness-raising, and not a little frightening, to think about the 1920s in depth, and to recognize how very similar they are to what we're going through now and to what we face in the 2020s. For one basic thing in both cases, the population of this country, and in fact of the world, is just emerging from a major pandemic. The Spanish flu, also known as the 1918 influenza, was an unusually deadly influenza pandemic caused by the H1N1 influenza A virus. Lasting from February 1918 to April 1920, it infected 500 million people, about a third of the world's population at the time, in 4 successive waves. The death toll is typically estimated to have been somewhere between 20 million and 50 million, although estimates range from a conservative 17 million to a possible high of 100 million, making it one of the deadliest pandemics in human history. Our current death toll worldwide stands at almost 4 million, but warning, that's for this wave. We are also barely, by the skin of our teeth, out from under Trump's grip and his America First rhetoric, so reminiscent of Warren Harding's campaign and presidency. The still poisonous undercurrent of right-wing rhetoric, threats, and violent acts are all too reminiscent of the rapid growth of the Ku Klux Klan and other ultra-right groups in the 20s, that nationalistic, anti-immigrant wave that looked with alarm and then horror at all progressive influence from any quarter, from women, from people of color, from lesbian and gay citizens. The backlash against women's enfranchisement, the suffocation of lesbian and gay openness and affirmation, all the reactive erasure to peace movements and education and good government and evolution against science itself, still smolders just off stage in the wings. The proliferation of mass communications via radio has its parallels with, of course, the Internet, and we already know a great many of the problems that brings with it. We have carried consumerism to the next levels and beyond, And while the mass-produced automobile revolutionized the 1920s, high-speed rail and, more dramatically, the beginning of space travel stands to revolutionize this decade. We saw the urbanization reach a milestone in the 1920 census, but now urbanization is no longer an emerging prediction. It's a fact, and it's likely to bring with it an electoral shift to the left, happily. But for every action there is a reaction, and eventually that may mean backlash. The grudge-holding grievance politics clung to by largely but not exclusively white males has, if anything, deepened, although none of them can ever specify just which values we are supposedly trampling. The concept that resources are not necessarily limited apparently seems to confound such mentalities. In fact, all the parallels are startling and perilous. So if any of us thought that we could dare now exhale since the pandemic seems over, or since Trump was trounced in his bid for re-election, we are forced to think again. Again, democracy is not a spectator sport. We'll have to roll up our sleeves and keep them rolled up. This must not be a decade as innocent as the Roaring Twenties were, one as certain of our own future, as trusting of our plucky, idealistic vision. To repeat those mistakes is to risk, even invite, financial disaster comparable to the crash and the Depression, another or extended period of extreme right-wing triumph, and most appallingly, another world war. Remember that the period between the wars was not called that at the time. It was called the period after the Great War. The Great War, since World War I, we were all assured, had earned the name of the War to End All Wars. Yet it would be followed by the rise in Europe of the National Socialist Party, and remember that Hitler was elected. And then Nazism perpetrated the worst horrors of the 20th century. This was after the great Bauhaus arts movement, the flourishing Weimar Republic, and lots of other liberalizations. The echo? Right-wing governments are rising in Europe again. But today, given atomic power, we cannot afford for this to be another period between the wars, and we dare not even countenance a World War III. The differences are important, though, and should be emphasized. Dominant among them is not good news, though. It's the fate of our planet itself. The clock is ticking and the time is short. Climate change has already begun and is moving much faster than expected. This time we better get it right, or there is no next time. There is now a worldwide women's movement unlike anything we've seen before. Half of humanity is now voiced and refusing to be silenced this time. In this country alone, people of color have been and remain on the move and are more united than in historical memory. Moreover, the demographic changes in this country are considerable and will make for a no longer European-American majority country within this decade. That's both a hopeful and a warning sign. Hopeful for obvious reasons, but warning because reactionary forces will undoubtedly, react. If we are vigilant and stick together, if we're careful and intelligent, if we trust the wonders that scientific knowledge can bestow on us and dare feel the empathy that our deepest politics demand of us for each other and for the planet, we just might squeak through. The brave people who dared lay down a lighted path for us in the 1920s, the Harlem Renaissance artists, the union activists, the women who fought for the vote and then fought to expand it, the gender benders driven into hiding who nonetheless left trails and clues. These are the footprints we walk in. More importantly, we leave our own footprints for those in 3021 and beyond. Those are my fighting words. Add yours on Twitter, and remember to tag us at WMC Live and use the hashtag Fighting Words. That's it for this week and for this season. And what a season it's been. We will be on summer hiatus until September, but we'll be seeing you then with bells on. You can follow me on Twitter, Facebook, and now Instagram at @TheRobinMorgan. And you can check out my blog at robinmorgan.net and find my latest book of poems, Dark Matter, and my brand new novel, Parallax, wherever books are sold. Opinions expressed on this program do not necessarily represent the Women's Media Center. Here's the family for Women's Media Center Live. Executive producer as well as founding and sustaining sponsor, Regina K. Scully. WMC president and co-executive producer of this program, Julie Burton. I'm Robin Morgan, your producer and host. Thank you for being with us. See you in September. Join us again next time on Women's Media Center Live.